Hi guys! Chapter 12, The Picnic. Of course, we know the Boxcar children are always talking about food, aren't they? And it's always interesting to find out what it is that they're going to eat. Remember the last chapter was about the apple pie, and I said it was cooked differently than any pie I had ever heard of. So this one is The Picnic. And if you notice the picture, there's a pot cooking over a fire. So I wonder what that could be. The children were waiting upon the dock when Joe came back, but it was too late then to find Mr. Browning. Jessie began, "You know, Joe, Grandfather said you should never build a fire outdoors unless someone older helped us. Now we have such a good place for a picnic, we thought we'd invite our school friends over for a picnic on the beach. They've never seen the island." Well, that sounds like a fun trip, doesn't it? "I'll be glad to help you build a fire if that's what you want," said Joe. "Oh, thanks, Joe," said Jessie. The four children invited their friends over Captain Daniel's telephone. Back then, they did not have cell phones. They had to use a different kind of phone. All of them said they would come. Henry's friend was a tall boy named Morris Wilder, and Jessie's friend was Morris's sister Marjorie. Violet invited her friend Barbara Black. Benny surprised them by saying he wanted to invite Mike Wood, a little boy who was always in trouble. "Mike and Benny will be quite a pair," cried Henry. "But I suppose he can invite anyone he likes. We all did." "We'll have fish chowder for dinner," said Jessie. "We can always get some fish from Captain Daniel. And we'll all pick blueberries after the others get here," said Henry. "That will be something for us to do." When the guests arrived, Watch was very excited. Mike had brought his big white dog Spotty with him. Jessie had a hard time trying to keep the dogs from fighting, but after a lot of barking, Watch and Spotty were friends. I can picture that. You know how dogs like to get to know each other. They sort of fight and then they become friends. "Let's race the dogs, Ben," cried Mike, who could never be still for very long. The two boys held the dogs for a minute and then let them go. Both dogs seemed to understand, for they raced to the beach where they dropped panting on the sand beside Joe. Watch knew the way and he got there first. "Spotty got there first," shouted Mike. "He did not," cried Benny. "He didn't even know the way." "Benny, Benny," said Henry, "don't start the picnic fighting." Here are the dogs racing. "Watch got there first, and you know it," said Benny. "Spotty is better than Watch," said Mike. "Spotty is not better than Watch," shouted Benny. "Watch can run faster than Spotty, and he got there first in the race." "You started this fight, Ben," said Mike. "I did not start it," shouted Benny. "Yes, you did too," shouted Mike. "Now you listen to me, young fellow," said Morris, catching Mike's hand. "You stop, or you'll have to go home." Mike began to jump up and down, when suddenly he jumped on a very sharp shell. Then Mike sat down, holding his foot and crying at the same time. Henry sat down too and tried to look at Mike's foot. He took out his box of things for fixing cuts. Remember, Grandfather had sent him that? "Keep still now, Mike," he said. "You've got a long cut there, but it's not deep. Let me fix it." The cut foot was a big help to everyone. It kept Mike in sight all morning, while the four older children and Joe picked blueberries. At noon, Jessie and Violet watched while Joe made a fire and boiled some water. Henry and Morris cut the potatoes and onions, and the chowder was soon ready. Everyone enjoyed the chowder, and the boys had made enough extra for supper too. After blueberries and milk, Jessie and Violet washed the dishes in the ocean, while Benny and Mike walked away slowly. "Keep an eye on Mike, Henry," said Jessie. "I can see them. They're just sitting over there on the rocks," said Henry. But the next time he looked, the boys had gone. "Where could they go?" he cried, getting up quickly. "There's no place for them to go, because I can see the whole beach from here." But the little boys were not in sight. As Henry climbed upon the rocks, he was very glad to hear Benny's voice. "I wonder who left that bottle here," said Benny. Henry and Morris looked under the rocks into the tiny cave. "How in the world did you boys get in there?" asked Henry. "The stone came off," said Benny. "It was like a door, and we pulled it away. It was awfully heavy." "Say, you fellows climb out of there and let us go in," said Morris. The little boys obeyed at once, and the two older boys crawled in and looked around. They saw a big stone table with an old bottle on it. "Let's take out the bottle," said Henry. "There may be something inside." "Look, Joe," said Morris. "See what Ben and Mike found?" "There's a paper inside the bottle," said Henry. "Shall we take it out?" "Why not?" said Joe, turning it over. "Maybe there's a name on the paper." "Let me get the paper out with my knife," said Henry. The mouth of the bottle was just wide enough for the knife. Henry pulled the paper out easily and read, "If found, Give to J. Alden, 6 feet from cross to Red Rock and 3 feet down. J.A. and R.W. Grandfather must have left it here when he was a boy, said Henry, but I don't see any cross. I do, said Mike. It's right over there. He pointed at a strange rock, and it did look like a cross. And there's the red rock, said Violet. See? This will be easy, said Morris. You run a string from the cross straight to the red rock. Then, what does it say? He looked at the paper again. 6 feet. Well, 6 feet from the cross, you dig there 3 feet. There must be something in there. The children were excited as they tied the string to the red rock. Joe showed them where 6 feet would be. Then they took turns digging with a spoon. With Watch and Spotty to help, they dug a hole 3 feet deep, but there was nothing in it but water. After an hour's digging, they had still not found anything. We can dig some other day, said Henry at last. It may be down 12 feet by now. The paper's really old. All the children but Mike were tired and were glad to sit down on the grass. The little fellow still sat beside the hole with Spotty, digging away with a spoon. And then suddenly he began to shout, It's mine! All mine, because I found it. You can't say it isn't because you all stopped digging. You can say he has found something. When the children ran to the hole, they saw Mike pulling out a black box covered with wet sand. And Mike went right on shouting, I found the cave too and made Ben help me take the door off. And I found the cross and I dug out the box and it's mine. Don't talk so much. Of course it's yours, Mike, said Henry. Why don't you open it? It was not hard to do this because the box was very old. Mike pulled off the cover with his fingers and the children saw a pile of old money. Mike put the money, one piece at a time, in the cover of the box. Just $5, said Morris. What a lot of money, Mike. Grandfather will give him a $5 bill, said Jessie. I think he would like to keep this old money he put in here when he was just a little boy. Wouldn't you like to have a new $5 bill, Mike? Yes, of course, said Mike, who had never had even a dollar bill before in his whole life. Just then the children heard a shouting coming over the water. Then they noticed a boy in a rowboat who was standing up shouting and pointing at the water. A dark head showed for a minute and then it went out of sight under the water. There's somebody in the water too, cried Morris. Henry heard Joe say to himself, Well, I'm well, and I'm going to do this. I'm not afraid. Joe took off his shoes, jumped into the water, and swam very fast. Bring the boat here, he shouted to the boy in the boat. But the boat went right past him. Oh, come back, Joe, cried Benny. He'll come back all right, said Morris. He's a wonderful swimmer. Look. As Morris spoke, Joe swam underwater suddenly, and when he came up, he was pulling the boy to the rowboat. It seemed like hours before Joe finally got the boy into the boat and pulled himself in. Good for Joe, shouted Henry. I hope he got there in time. Everybody ought to know how to swim, said Morris. That boy was afraid. He just stood there and yelled. He couldn't even bring the boat over when Joe asked him to. All this time, Mike had not said anything. He stood very still as he looked out over the water. The little fellow seemed to have turned to stone. Why are you so scared? Asked Henry. I think it's Pat, said Mike, still staring at the boat. Pat? Who is he? Asked Henry. He's my brother, said Mike. He's 11 years old. I think he was the one in the water. You can't see that far, said Morris. What makes you think so, Mike? Well, I told him there would be something to eat at this picnic, and that maybe we'd play ball. I begin to see, said Henry, looking at Morris. Do you know who the older boy is? Maybe Johnny, said Mike. I told Johnny, too, and he knew about a rowboat he could get. How did he get the boat? Asked Morris. Well, they just took it, said Mike. What an awful thing to do, said Henry. Besides, they can't swim or row. It didn't seem so, for Joe was rowing. One boy was out of sight in the boat, and the other boy sat on one end. When Jessie saw the boat coming, she called to Marjorie, Let's run to the barn and get some blankets and towels. Good for you, Jessie, called Joe when the girls brought the blankets. They laid them down on the other side of the fire. Jessie and Marjorie spread out the blankets while Henry and Morris caught the boat as it landed on the beach. It is Pat, said Mike in a frightened voice. Isn't it, Johnny? Yes, said Johnny, but he'll be all right. This man said so. There they are, taking him. Looks like they're laying him on the blanket. Really not a good idea, was it? They did some pretty awful things. They stole a boat. They went out in the boat when they didn't know how to swim or row, and they weren't really invited, were they? He's lucky, said Henry. Lucky that Joe knew how to swim. Pat was very still when the boys helped Joe lift him out of the boat and roll him in a blanket by the fire. We won't talk to him now, said Joe, rubbing the boy's hair with a towel. We'll let him sleep first. He's all tired out. I guess you won't have to talk to him, said Johnny, who was very white. We won't ever take a boat again. No, I don't believe you will either, called Joe, as he went back to the hut for dry clothes. Just then Mike said, Pat didn't get any dinner. Will you heat up the chowder for him, Henry? He can't eat when he's sound asleep, can he? Asked Morris. No, but he'll wake up when he smells the chowder, said Mike. Maybe I could have some more myself, because I didn't eat much lunch. I should say you didn't, said Morris. Only 3 bowls full. I'll tell you what we can do, said Joe, who had come back wearing dry clothes. We have just enough to play ball if Mike is eating and doesn't want to play. Oh, I want to play, shouted Mike, jumping up and forgetting about the cut on his foot. And so all the children played ball. Later, there was more chowder for everyone, and Pat did wake up when he smelled the food. This is the best picnic I've ever been to, said Mike, passing his bowl again. Hold on there, warned Joe. Don't give him any more, Henry. 6 bowls of chowder in one day are enough for one small boy. Just then, Captain Daniel came with the boat to take the children home. And now Benny began to cry because his friend was going. Oh, what are you crying about, Ben? Asked Mike. I wouldn't cry at nothing. So nobody cried when the company started for home in the boat. When Mike could not hear Benny's answer, he put his 2 hands up to his mouth and shouted, Spotty can run faster than Watch. Well, Benny, don't you care, said Henry. Just be glad the day is over with no more trouble. You're right, said Joe. What a day. Then Henry remembered that Joe had said he was well again. And when Henry told Jessie about it later, she thought it was very strange, too.